Black boy gives up his bus seat to an old lady. Her secret note leads to a multi-million-dollar foundation. The number 47 bus trundled along its usual route through the heart of Chicago, its worn suspension creaking as it navigated the pothole-ridden streets. Inside, the familiar cacophony of city life filtered through the grimy windows, car horns blaring, street vendors hawking their wares, and the constant hum of pedestrian chatter. Seated near the back of the bus, 17-year-old Jamal Thompson sat hunched over his backpack, his fingers idly tracing the frayed edges of his textbook. The young man's eyes were fixed on the passing scenery, but his mind was elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of the upcoming calculus test and the mountain of homework waiting for him at home. Jamal had always been a diligent student, driven by an innate curiosity and a burning desire to make something of himself. Growing up in the south side of Chicago hadn't been easy, but his mother had instilled in him a deep appreciation for education and hard work. "Knowledge is the key to breaking cycles," she would often say, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and determination. As the bus lurched to a stop, Jamal's reverie was broken by the hiss of the hydraulic doors. He glanced up, watching as a stream of passengers filed onto the already crowded vehicle. Among them was an elderly woman, her silver hair neatly tucked beneath a pale blue hat, had seen better days. She moved slowly, her gnarled hands gripping a well-worn cane as she navigated the narrow aisle. Jamal's eyes met those of the old woman, and he saw the weariness etched into the lines of her face. Without hesitation, he stood up, gathering his backpack and books. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying over the din of the bus, "please, take my seat." The woman's eyes widened in surprise, a flicker of something unreadable passing across her features. For a moment, Jamal thought she might refuse. Then she offered him a small nod. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice thin but clear. "That's very kind of you." As the woman settled into the vacated seat, Jamal couldn't help but notice the way some of the other passengers were looking at him. There were smiles of approval, nods of appreciation, but also a few frowns and raised eyebrows. He was used to it by now, the mix of reactions his presence often elicited in public spaces. It was a sad reality he had learned to navigate from a young age. Jamal turned his attention back to his textbook, now standing and swaying with the motion of the bus. He tried to focus on the complex equations before him, but found his thoughts drifting back to the elderly woman. There was something about her that intrigued him. Perhaps it was the way she had looked at him, or the slight tremor in her voice as she thanked him. The next few stops passed in a blur of motion and noise. Passengers came and went, the ebb and flow of city life playing out in microcosm within the confines of the bus. Jamal remained standing, one hand gripping the overhead rail while the other held his book. Every so often, his gaze would flicker to the elderly woman who sat with her eyes closed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. As the bus approached Jamal's stop, he began to gather his things. He had a shift at the local grocery store in an hour, and he needed to drop off his school supplies at home before heading to work. Just as he was about to move towards the exit, he felt a light touch on his arm. "Young man," the elderly woman said, her eyes now open and fixed intently on Jamal's face. "I wonder if I might trouble you for one more kindness." Jamal hesitated, glancing at the approaching bus stop. He didn't want to be late for work, but something in the woman's voice made him pause. "Of course, ma'am," he replied, curiosity getting the better of him. "What can I do for you?" The woman reached into her purse, her movements slow and deliberate. After a moment, she withdrew a small, folded piece of paper. "I wonder if you might read this for me," she said, holding out the note. "My eyes aren't what they used to be, and I'm afraid I've left my glasses at home." Jamal took the paper, unfolding it carefully. He expected to see a shopping list or perhaps an address, but what he found instead made his breath catch in his throat. The note, written in a shaky hand, contained just a few lines. "To the young man who gave up his seat, your kindness has not gone unnoticed. Meet me at Grant Park, by the Buckingham Fountain, tomorrow at noon. There's something you need to know. Margaret Holloway." Jamal looked up from the note, his mind racing. The elderly woman, Margaret, was watching him intently, her pale blue eyes searching his face. "Well?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does it say?" For a moment, Jamal was at a loss for words. He glanced at the bus stop outside, his stop, and made a split-second decision. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, handing the note back to her. "But I think this is something you'll want to read for yourself. It's an invitation." Margaret's eyebrows rose in surprise. An invitation? To what, may I ask? Jamal hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "It's asking the person who gave up their seat to meet at Grant Park tomorrow," said carefully, "by the Buckingham Fountain at noon." A slow smile spread across Margaret's face, transforming her features. For a moment, the years seemed to fall away, and Jamal caught a glimpse of the young woman she must have once been. "Ah," she said, a hint of mischief in her voice. "I see. And will you be there, young man?" The bus had come to a stop, and Jamal knew he needed to get off. But as he looked at Margaret, he found himself nodding. "Yes," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Yes, I'll be there." As Jamal stepped off the bus, his mind was whirling with questions. Who was Margaret Holloway? What did she want to tell him? And why did he feel like his life was about to change in ways he couldn't begin to imagine? Little did Jamal know that this chance encounter on a city bus was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, his community, and the power of human connection. As the bus pulled away, carrying Margaret Holloway with it, Jamal stood on the sidewalk, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The following day dawned bright and clear, a rarity for Chicago in late autumn. Jamal had barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities and questions about the mysterious Margaret Holloway and her cryptic note. He'd made up an excuse to skip his morning shift at the grocery store, something he'd never done before. The gravity of this meeting weighed heavily on him, though he couldn't explain why. As the hands of his worn wristwatch ticked closer to noon, Jamal found himself standing at the edge of Grant Park, his eyes fixed on the majestic Buckingham Fountain. The water danced and sparkled in the midday sun, oblivious to the nervous energy radiating from the young man. "You came," a familiar voice called out, causing Jamal to turn. Margaret Holloway stood a few feet away, looking markedly different from the day before. Gone was the frail old woman from the bus. In her place stood a woman who, while still elderly, carried herself with a dignified grace. Her silver hair was neatly coiffed, and she wore a smart tweed jacket over a pair of tailored slacks. "Mrs. Holloway," Jamal greeted her, surprise evident in his voice. Yes, I came." Margaret smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "Please, call me Margaret. And thank you for being here, Jamal. I hope you don't mind that I asked around about you. Small communities have long memories, and your kindness yesterday didn't go unnoticed." Jamal shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. It was nothing, really. Anyone would have done the same. "But they didn't, did they?" Margaret said softly. "You did, and that's why we're here today." She gestured to a nearby bench. "Shall we sit? What I have to tell you might take a while." As they settled onto the bench, Jamal couldn't help but notice the way Margaret's hands shook slightly as she opened her purse. She withdrew an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. "Jamal," Margaret began, her voice taking on a somber tone, "what I'm about to tell you is a story that spans decades. It's a story of mistakes and regrets, prejudice and redemption, and it's a story that I hope will change both our lives." She opened the journal, revealing pages filled with faded handwriting. 60 years ago, I was a young woman living in this very city, had dreams, ambitions, and, I'm ashamed to say, a heart full of misguided beliefs. Margaret's eyes misted over as she continued. "I was raised in a family that held certain views of people of color, views that I now know were deeply wrong and harmful. But back then, I didn't question them. I accepted them as truth." Jamal felt a knot forming in his stomach. He had an inkling of where this might be going, but he remained silent, allowing Margaret to continue. "In the summer of 1963, I was working as a secretary at a law firm downtown. One day, a young black man came in, seeking legal advice. His name was Robert Thompson." Jamal's breath caught in his throat. Thompson was his last name. Surely it was just a coincidence? Margaret seemed to sense his reaction. "Yes, Jamal. Robert Thompson was your grandfather." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Jamal struggled to process this information. His grandfather had died before Jamal was born, and his family rarely spoke of him. All Jamal knew was that he had been a civil rights activist in Chicago during the 1960s. Robert came to the firm because he was organizing peaceful protests against segregation in Chicago's schools, Margaret continued. He needed legal counsel to ensure the protests remained within the bounds of the law. But when he walked in, I refused to help him. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she recounted the painful memory. I told him we didn't serve his kind here. I was cruel, Jamal, so needlessly cruel. The look of hurt and disappointment on his face, it's haunted me for 60 years. Jamal felt a complex mix of emotions swirling within him, anger, confusion, sadness. But as he looked at the regret etched deeply into Margaret's face, he also felt a glimmer of something else. Understanding? Compassion? He wasn't sure. Robert didn't argue with me, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. He simply looked at me and said, I hope one day you'll see that we're all just people, ma'am. People deserving of respect and dignity. Then he turned and walked out. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath before continuing. Those words, they stayed with me. They forced me to confront the ugliness of my beliefs. It wasn't an immediate change, but it was the beginning of a journey that's lasted my entire life. Margaret turned to face Jamal directly, her blue eyes intense with emotion. I've spent the last 6 decades trying to make amends for the person I was that day. I've worked in civil rights organizations, volunteered in underprivileged communities, fought against the very prejudices I once held. But I never had the chance to apologize to Robert. She reached out, her hand hovering uncertainly over Jamal's. When you gave up your seat for me yesterday, when you showed me kindness without hesitation, I saw Robert in you. The same dignity, the same inherent goodness, and I knew I had to tell you this story. Jamal's mind was reeling. He had come expecting, well, he wasn't sure what he had expected, but certainly not this. Not a days-old tale of prejudice and regret that was somehow intimately connected to his own family history. Mrs. Hull, Margaret, Jamal began, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. It's overwhelming. Margaret nodded, understanding in her eyes. I know, Jamal, and I'm not telling you this to burden you or to seek absolution. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the impact your grandfather had, not just on the civil rights movement, but on individuals like me. And because... She paused, seeming to gather her courage. Because I want to make things right. Not just symbolically, but tangibly. Jamal, I want to pay for your college education. Jamal's eyes widened in shock. What? No, I can't. That's too much. You don't owe me anything. Perhaps not, Margaret said gently. But I owed it to your grandfather, and in his absence I'd like to offer it to you. A chance to pursue your dreams without the burden of student debt. A small step towards righting a decades-old wrong. As Jamal sat there, the sounds of the city fading into the background, he felt as though he was standing at a crossroads. Behind him lay the weight of history, pain of prejudice, and the long shadow of injustice. Before him stretched a future suddenly bright with possibility, offered by the most unexpected of sources. I need time to think about this, Jamal said finally. To talk to my family. This isn't just about me. Margaret nodded, a smile of understanding crossing her face. Of course. Take all the time you need. But know this, Jamal. Regardless of what you decide, meeting you has been a gift. You've shown me that the legacy of good people like your grandfather lives on. And that gives me hope for the future. As they sat there by the fountain, an unlikely pair united by a chance encounter, and the long arc of history, neither Jamal nor Margaret could have predicted the profound impact this meeting would have on both their lives. The story that began with a simple act of kindness on a city bus was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The days following Jamal's meeting with Margaret Holloway passed in a blur of conflicting emotions and sleepless nights. The young man found himself grappling with a whirlwind of thoughts, each one vying for dominance in his mind. The weight of history, both personal and societal, pressed down on him with an intensity he had never before experienced. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Jamal finally mustered the courage to broach the subject with his family. The Thompson household, a modest 2-bedroom apartment in the heart of Chicago's South Side, was buzzing with its usual weekend energy. The aroma of his mother's famous pot roast wafted through the air as Jamal's younger siblings, twins Aisha and Andre, bickered good-naturedly over a board game in the living room. "Mom, Dad," Jamal began, his voice wavering slightly as he entered the kitchen. "I need to talk to you about something important." Loretta Thompson, a woman whose strength and grace had been the bedrock of the family for as long as Jamal could remember, turned from the stove with a look of concern. "What is it, baby? Is everything all right?" Michael Thompson, Jamal's father, lowered the newspaper he had been reading, his brow furrowed with worry. "Son? What's going on?" Jamal took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation ahead. As the words began to pour out of him, recounting his encounter with Margaret on the bus and their subsequent meeting in the park, he watched a myriad of emotions play across his parents' faces. Surprise, confusion, anger, and finally, a complex mix of pain and understanding. When Jamal finished his story, a heavy silence fell over the kitchen. It was his father who finally broke it, his voice rough with emotion. "I can't believe it. After all these years." Loretta moved to sit beside her husband, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Michael, maybe this is a sign. A chance for some kind of, I don't know, closure?" Michael shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Closure? How can there be closure for decades of systemic racism? For the pain and struggle my father endured? For the opportunities denied to him and countless others?" Jamal felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't considered how deeply this revelation might affect his father, how it might reopen old wounds. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "No, son," Michael interrupted, his expression softening. "You have nothing to be sorry for. You showed kindness to a stranger, just as your grandfather would have done. I'm proud of you for that." Loretta nodded in agreement. "Your father's right, Jamal. What you did was beautiful. And this Margaret woman, well, at least she's trying to make amends. That's more than can be said for a lot of people." "But her offer," Jamal said hesitant. "The money for college. I don't know if I can accept it. Feels wrong somehow." Michael leaned back in his chair, thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, son, your grandfather used to say that progress often comes from unexpected places. But sometimes the path to reconciliation is paved with difficult choices." "What do you think I should do, Dad?" Jamal asked, suddenly feeling very young and unsure. Michael was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant as if looking into the past. "I think," he said slowly, "that you need to follow your heart on this one, Jamal. But remember, whatever you decide, it's not just about you or Margaret Holloway. It's about the future you want to build, the change you want to see in the world." Loretta reached across the table, squeezing Jamal's hand. "We'll support you, baby, no matter what you choose. But don't rush into anything. Take some time to really think about what this means, not just for you, but for our family and our community." As the conversation continued late into the night, Jamal felt a strange mix of emotions washing over him. There was the weight of responsibility, the complexity of forgiveness, and the tantalizing promise of opportunity. But beneath it all was a growing sense of purpose, a feeling that he stood at the precipice of something much larger than himself. Over the next few weeks, Jamal found himself on an unexpected journey of self-discovery and historical exploration. He spent hours in the local library, poring over books about the civil rights movement in Chicago. He reached out to his grandmother, his father's mother, who shared stories about his grandfather that had never before been spoken aloud. With each passing day, the figure of Robert Thompson grew more vivid in Jamal's mind. He learned of his grandfather's unwavering commitment to nonviolent protest, his belief in the power of education to transform lives, and his dream of a truly integrated and equal society. One particularly poignant story stuck with Jamal. In the summer of 1966, during the Chicago Freedom Movement, Robert Thompson had led a group of protesters on a march through an all-white neighborhood. They were met with jeers, thrown rocks, and violent threats. But Robert, standing at the front of the group, had simply started singing, "We Shall Overcome." His voice, strong and unwavering, had gradually been joined by others until the entire group was singing, their voices drowning out the hate-filled shouts of the counter-protester. As Jamal delved deeper into his family's history, he also found himself reflecting on his own experiences growing up as a young black man in Chicago. He thought about the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, racism he had encountered, the stereotypes he had to constantly disprove, and the extra burden he often felt to represent his entire race in predominantly white spaces. But he also thought about the progress that had been made, the doors that had been opened by the sacrifices of his grandfather's generation. He thought about his diverse group of friends at school, the black teachers and professionals who served as role models, and the slowly changing face of media and politics. It was during this period of reflection that Jamal decided to reach out to Margaret again. They met at a small cafe near Grant Park, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the city streets. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Jamal began, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of hot chocolate. "About my grandfather, about you, about, well, everything." Margaret nodded encouragingly, her eyes warm with understanding. "And what conclusions have you reached, my dear?" Jamal took a deep breath. I think I want to accept your offer, but not just for me. I want to use this opportunity to continue my grandfather's work, fight for equality and justice in my own way." Smile spread across Margaret's face, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Oh, Jamal, you have no idea how happy that makes me. Please, tell me more. What do you envision?" Over the next hour, Jamal outlined his plans. He wanted to study law, with a focus on civil rights and social justice. But more than that, he wanted to establish a foundation in his grandfather's name, one that would provide scholarships to underprivileged students and support community development initiatives in Chicago's South Side. "I want to turn this act of personal reconciliation into something bigger," Jamal explained, his voice growing more confident with each word. "Something that can help heal the wounds of the past and build a better future for everyone in our community." Margaret listened intently, occasionally wiping away a tear. When Jamal finished speaking, she reached across the table and grasped his hand. "Jamal Thompson," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "you are a remarkable young man. Your grandfather would be so proud of you, and I am honored to play a small part in your journey." As they hammered out the details of their agreement, Jamal felt a sense of purpose settling over him. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But he also knew that he was part of something larger than himself, a continuum of struggle and progress that stretched back through generations. In the weeks that followed, Jamal's life transformed in ways he could never have imagined. As news of the Robert Thompson Foundation spread, it sparked intense discussions about race, reconciliation, and social responsibility in Chicago and beyond. Some praised the initiative as a powerful example of how individuals could work to address historical injustices. Others criticized it, arguing that it placed too much burden on the victims of racism to forgive and move forward. Jamal found himself at the center of a media storm, giving interviews and speaking at community events. It was overwhelming at times, but he drew strength from the memory of his grandfather and the unwavering support of his family. One crisp autumn morning, as Jamal stood on the steps of his high school preparing to announce the foundation's first round of scholarships, caught sight of Margaret in the crowd. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Jamal felt the weight of history. Pain, progress, and its endless possibility for change. As he stepped up to the microphone, Jamal thought about the long journey that had led him to this point. It had begun with a simple act of kindness on a city bus, but it had grown into something far greater. It was a testament to the power of human connection, the importance of confronting the past, and the endless capacity for growth and change. "Good morning," Jamal began, his voice clear and strong. "Today, we're not just announcing scholarships. We're taking a step towards building the kind of world my grandfather Robert Thompson dreamed of. A world where acts of kindness can bridge divides, where confronting our past can heal our present, and where every young person, regardless of their background, has the opportunity to reach their full potential." As Jamal continued his speech, he felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. Gratitude for the sacrifices of those who came before him, for the unexpected twists of fate that had brought him to this moment, and for the chance to be a part of something truly transformative. The journey that had begun with a note on a city bus was far from over. In fact, for Jamal Thompson, it was just beginning. And as he looked out at the sea of faces before him, black, white, and every shade in between, he knew that together, they had the power to write a new chapter in the ongoing story of America's struggle for equality and justice. The years that followed the establishment of the Robert Thompson Foundation were a whirlwind of activity, growth, and unexpected challenges for Jamal. As he navigated the complex world of higher education at Northwestern University's prestigious law school, he found himself constantly balancing his academic pursuits with his responsibilities to the foundation and his community. Foundation, born from a chance encounter and a desire for reconciliation, had grown beyond anything Jamal or Margaret could have imagined. What started as a scholarship program for underprivileged students in Chicago's South Side had blossomed into a multifaceted organization tackling issues of racial equity, education reform, and community development. On a crisp autumn morning in his third year of law school, Jamal stood before a mirror in his small apartment, adjusting his tie with nervous fingers. Today marked the 5th anniversary of the foundation, and he was slated to give a keynote speech at a major fundraising gala. As he studied his reflection, he couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed. Gone was the uncertain teenager who had given up his seat on a bus. In his place stood a young man on the cusp of a promising career, eyes bright with purpose and determination. Yet, as Jamal smoothed down his jacket, felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. "Jamal, are you ready?" Mother's voice called out. "Coming, Mom," he replied, taking one last look in the mirror before grabbing his speech notes and heading out. The drive to the venue was filled with a comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional comment from his father about the unseasonably warm weather or his mother's gentle reminders about the schedule for the day. As they pulled up to the Grand Hotel hosting the gala, Jamal felt a flutter of nerves in his stomach. Despite having spoken at numerous events over the years, the magnitude of this particular occasion wasn't lost on him. The ballroom was a sea of faces, some familiar, others new. Jamal made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. He spotted Margaret near the front, her silver hair elegantly coiffed, her eyes twinkling with pride as she chatted with a group of donors. As Jamal took his place at the podium, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He looked out at the assembled crowd, community leaders, educators, activists, and beneficiaries of the Foundation's program. Each face represented a thread in the complex tapestry of change they were weaving together. 5 years ago, Jamal began, his voice strong and clear. A simple act of kindness on a city bus set in motion a chain of events that none of us could have predicted. Today, we gather not just to celebrate the achievements of the Robert Thompson Foundation, but to recommit ourselves to the ongoing work of building a more just and equitable society. As Jamal spoke, he recounted the Foundation's accomplishments. Hundreds of scholarships awarded, community centers established in underserved neighborhoods, mentorship programs connecting young people with successful professionals who looked like them. But he also acknowledged the challenges they faced: persistent achievement gap in schools, the ongoing struggle against systemic racism, the economic disparities that continue to divide communities. "Our work is far from over," Jamal continued, his voice taking on a passionate edge. "But as I look around this room, I'm filled with hope. I see the spirit of my grandfather, Robert Thompson, alive in each of you. I see it in the teachers who go above and beyond for their students, in the community organizers who refuse to give up in the face of setbacks, in the young people who dare to dream of a better future." As Jamal's speech drew to a close, he felt a lump forming in his throat. "And I see it in one particular person who taught me that it's never too late to confront our past and work towards reconciliation. Margaret Holloway, would you please stand?" A murmur went through the crowd as Margaret rose to her feet, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Margaret's courage in confronting her past actions and her commitment to making amends didn't just change my life. It sparked a movement. It showed us that real change begins with individual acts of courage and compassion. Margaret, on behalf of the Foundation and all those whose lives have been touched by your generosity, thank you. The room erupted in applause as Jamal stepped down from the podium to embrace Margaret. As they hugged, Jamal felt the weight of history in that moment, the long arc of struggle and progress that had brought them to this point. The rest of the gala passed in a blur of congratulations, conversations, and promises of continued support. It was late into the night when Jamal finally had a moment to himself, stepping out onto a balcony for a breath of fresh air. As he gazed out at the Chicago skyline, the city lights twinkling like stars, Jamal felt a presence beside him. He turned to find Margaret, a gentle smile on her face. "You did wonderfully tonight, Jamal," he said, her voice warm with pride. "Your grandfather would have been so proud." Jamal nodded, feeling a mix of emotions well up inside him. "I hope so. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough, if we're really making a difference." Margaret placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Oh, my dear boy, you're doing more than enough. Change doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow process, often invisible day to day. But when we look back, we see how far we've come." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the sounds of the city a distant hum below them. "You know," Margaret continued, her voice taking on a reflective tone, "when I first met you on that bus, I never could have imagined where that encounter would lead. You've taught me so much, Jamal, about forgiveness, about the power of second chances, about the importance of never stopping in the fight for what's right." Jamal felt a lump forming in his throat. "You've taught me a lot too, Margaret, about the courage it takes to confront our mistakes, about the transformative power of making amends." As they stood there, an unlikely pair united by a shared commitment to justice and reconciliation, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose washing over him. The path ahead was still long and fraught with challenges, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. The next few years saw Jamal diving deeper into his legal studies, specializing in civil rights law. He interned at prestigious firms and worked on high-profile cases, always with an eye towards how he could use his growing expertise to further the Foundation's mission. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were setbacks and controversies. Some critics accused the Foundation of perpetuating a savior complex, arguing that it didn't address the root causes of systemic racism. Others questioned the ethics of accepting money from someone who had once held racist views, no matter how reformed they might be now. Jamal faced these challenges head-on, engaging in difficult conversations and constantly reevaluating the Foundation's approaches. He learned the delicate art of balancing idealism with pragmatism, of staying true to the Foundation's core mission, while remaining flexible enough to adapt to changing needs and perspective. Through it all, Jamal's relationship with Margaret deepened and evolved. She became more than just a benefactor or a partner in the Foundation's work. She became a mentor, friend, and in many ways, a second grandmother to him. As Margaret's health began to decline in her late 80s, Jamal found himself spending more time with her, listening to stories of her life and the journey that had led her to that fateful day on the bus. He came to understand the depth of her remorse for her past actions and the genuine transformation she had undergone. It was during one of these visits, as they sat in Margaret's sun-drenched living room surrounded by photos of her family and mementos from her decades of civil rights work, she broached a subject that had been on her mind. "Jamal," said, voice frailer than it had once been but still filled with warmth, "I want you to know that I've made arrangements for the bulk of my estate to go to the Foundation when I'm gone." Jamal started to protest. Margaret held up a hand to stop him. "No, my dear, this is something I've thought long and hard about. My own children are well provided for, and they understand and support this decision. I want my legacy to be one of continued work, equality, and justice." Tears welled up in Jamal's eyes as the full impact of Margaret's words sank in. This generous act would ensure the Foundation's work could continue and expand for years to come. But more than that, it was a powerful symbol of Margaret's commitment to making amends, her belief in the transformative power of education and opportunity. As Jamal left Margaret's house that day, he felt a complex mix of emotions: gratitude, responsibility, and a renewed determination honor the trust placed in him. The journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness on a bus grown into something far greater than he could have ever imagined. Looking ahead, Jamal knew that the work of the Robert Thompson Foundation and his own personal mission to continue his grandfather's legacy was far from over. There were still battles to be fought, minds to be changed, and lives to be improved. But as he walked down the tree-lined street, the late afternoon sun warm on his face, Jamal felt a sense of hope rising within him. He thought about his grandfather, a man he had never met, but whose spirit had guided him on this remarkable journey. Thought about Margaret, whose courage in confronting her past had opened up new possibilities for reconciliation and progress. And he thought about all the lives that had been touched and transformed by the ripple effects of that one moment on a city bus. As he reached the corner, Jamal paused, looking back at Margaret's house. He made a silent promise, to her, to his grandfather, and to himself. Keep pushing forward, keep working towards a more just and equitable world. The road ahead might be long and challenging, but Jamal Thompson was ready to walk it, one step at a time. The years rolled on, each one bringing new challenges and triumphs for Jamal Thompson and the Robert Thompson Foundation. As Jamal entered his 30s, he found himself at the helm of an organization that had grown far beyond its humble beginnings, touching lives across Chicago and beyond. On a warm spring morning, 10 years after the Foundation's inception, Jamal stood before a crowd gathered in the heart of Chicago's South Side. The occasion was the grand opening of the Robert Thompson Community Center, a state-of-the-art facility that would serve as a hub for education, job training, and community empowerment. As Jamal cut the ribbon, his parents beaming proudly by his side, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had led to this moment. The center was more than just a building. It was a testament to the power of perseverance, reconciliation, and the enduring impact of one man's legacy. This center, Jamal began his speech, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, is not just a gift to our community. It's a challenge to each of us to carry forward the work of those who came before us, continue striving for a more just and equitable society. As he spoke, Jamal's eyes scanned the crowd, taking in the diverse faces of young and old, representing the rich tapestry of Chicago's South Side. His gaze lingered on a group of teenagers near the front, their eyes bright with hope and possibility. In them, he saw echoes of himself at that age, full of dreams, yet facing systemic barriers that threatened to hold them back. To the young people here today, Jamal continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone, I want you to know that this center is for you. It's a place where you can dream big, where you can find the support and resources you need to turn those dreams into reality. But more than that, I want you to know that you are the future of this community, of this city, of this nation. Your voices matter, your lives matter, and we're here to ensure you have every opportunity to reach your full potential. As the applause died down and the crowd began to disperse, Jamal found himself approached by a young girl, no more than 12 or 13 years old. Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice slightly trembling with nervousness. I just wanted to say thank you. My big brother got a scholarship from your foundation last year. He's the first in our family to go to college. Jamal knelt down to the girl's level, a warm smile spreading across his face. What's your name? He asked gently. Amara, she replied, her confidence growing. Well, Amara, thank you for telling me that. It means a lot to hear how the foundation has helped your family. Tell me, what do you want to be when you grow up? Amara's eyes lit up. I want to be a doctor, she said without hesitation. But everyone says it's too hard, too expensive. Jamal felt a familiar fire ignite in his chest, the same determination that had driven him all these years. Amara, listen to me. It won't be easy, but if that's your dream, don't let anyone tell you it's impossible. Work hard, stay focused, and know that there are people and organizations out there ready to support you. Who knows, maybe one day you'll be standing here, opening a clinic in this very community. As Amara walked away, a new spring in her step, Jamal felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see his father, Michael, looking at him with pride. You know, son, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion, your grandfather would be so proud of you, of all of this. Jamal nodded, feeling the familiar mix of joy and sadness that always accompanied thoughts of the grandfather he'd never known. "I hope so, Dad. I really do." That evening, as the sun set over Chicago, casting a golden glow across the city's skyline, Jamal found himself in a quiet moment of reflection. He thought about Margaret Holloway, who had passed away peacefully 2 years prior, leaving behind a legacy of transformation and reconciliation. Her substantial bequest to the foundation had allowed them to expand their programs and build the very center they had opened today. He thought about the countless individuals whose lives had been touched by the foundation's work, the students who had received scholarships, the families who had found support and resources, communities that had been uplifted. But most of all, he thought about the work that still lay ahead. Despite all the progress that had been made, there were still systemic inequalities to be addressed, minds to be changed, and battles to be fought. As if on cue, Jamal's phone buzzed with a news alert. Controversial police shooting had occurred in a neighboring city, reigniting debates about racial profiling and police brutality. Jamal sighed, feeling the weight of the work yet to be done. But as he read through the article, something caught his eye. A quote from a community organizer on the ground. "We're not just protesting. We're building. We're creating dialogue. We're working towards real, lasting change. And we're doing it together, across racial lines." Inspired by organizations like the Robert Thompson Foundation, that show us what's possible when we confront our past and work towards reconciliation. Jamal felt a surge of emotion as he read those words. It was a reminder that the ripples of change could spread far beyond what one could see or measure. The work they were doing wasn't just about providing scholarships or building community centers. It was about changing narratives, shifting paradigms, and inspiring others to take up the mantle of justice and equality. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Jamal made his way to his home office. He had a speech to prepare for an upcoming fundraising event, proposals to review for new foundation initiatives, and a stack of letters from scholarship recipients to read through. But before he dove into his work, Jamal took a moment to look at the framed photo on his desk. It was a picture of his grandfather, Robert Thompson, standing proudly at a civil rights rally in the 1960s. Next to it was a more recent photo, Jamal and Margaret Holloway, smiling together at the Foundation's 5th anniversary gala. These two images, side by side, told a story of transformation, the long arc of justice bending slowly but surely towards progress. They were a reminder of where he had come from and why he continued to push forward. As Jamal settled into his chair and opened his laptop, he felt a renewed sense of purpose washing over him. The journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness on a city bus had grown into something far greater than he could have ever imagined. But in many ways, it was still just beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome, more minds to change. But Jamal Thompson was ready to face them all. Armed with the legacy of his grandfather, the lessons learned from Margaret, and the unwavering belief that small acts of kindness and courage could, indeed, change the world. As he began to type, Jamal smiled to himself. The story of the black boy who gave his seat to an elderly lady and the shocking note that changed everything was far from over. In fact, it was being written anew every day, in the lives touched, communities transformed, and the hope kindled in the hearts of people like Yamamara. And as long as there were stories like these to be written, Jamal knew that the work of the Robert Thompson Foundation and his own personal mission to continue his grandfather's legacy would never truly be finished. But that was okay, because in the end, it wasn't about reaching a final destination. It was about the journey itself, and the lives changed along the way. With that thought in mind, Jamal Thompson turned his attention to the task at hand, ready to write the next chapter in this ongoing story of hope, reconciliation, and the enduring power of human kindness.